Hello and welcome to the dark side. It is good to see you. I'm your host, Tabitha Purple, and TC Storm will be joining us shortly. Thank you that you join us for our weekly dose of the dark side. We've gone to educational topics, and so every week we will do a couple of news stories, my favorite news story or the one that I've picked, which is really difficult, and TC Storm will do his favorite news story that week, and we will then get into a topic. And this week's topic is about austerity and the effects that it has on the Black community, and how it disproportionately affects the poor, and what are you to expect and looking at when it comes to austerity measures. What does it mean for you? How has it shaped and changed the landscape? For those of you not based in the UK, this is predominantly a UK-based topic, but austerity measures have taken place throughout different countries. And so if this is something that you hear your governments deciding or talking about, then we know this topic from somewhere else, and maybe we should be a bit more alarmed and concerned. So that's the topic we're going to be talking about this evening. I have been told that I need to slow down, so let me talk a little slower. For our international viewers, I forget, I apologize. Let's have a look at my news story for today. This news story is taken from The Guardian, out of the UK, and basically Hong Kongers who live in the UK have asked Suella Braverman to ditch the repressive anti-protest bill. So I picked this story because this is one that TC Storm has been talking about for quite some time. The anti-protest bill is repressive, it's archaic, it has all of the hallmarks of nations that we find or that the UK has the tendency to look down upon, and yet still it's being pushed to go through. And so there's a couple of things to point out here. Hong Kongers obviously come from a place where they feel that those rights are being impinged on. They're dealing with the transition of power between the UK and China, and they've had a lot. If you've been following any kind of news, you will have seen the protests, you will have seen the problems that they're encountering. And what they're saying is that the UK bill actually mirrors the bill that allows China to do its protest management. And so there's a couple of points that really just struck me, because they said one of the parts of the letter that they wrote to the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, is that the repressive measures threaten to paralyze entire social movements. And so many people have come from Hong Kong to the UK in the hope of a better life for themselves, for their loved ones, to be able to exercise their rights, to be able to exercise their freedom without fear, and then have come to the UK and found that this law, this repressive law, is being put into place. And they're shocked, they're horrified, they can't believe that this is going through. And so they've really concerned about two particular aspects, which is the Serious Disruption Prevention Orders, otherwise known as SDPOs, and the Stop and Search Powers. And so the SDPOs basically appear to them as open-air prison. So you, if you are simply seeking to exercise your rights, the new bill can actually put GPS tagging on you. It can restrict you from using the internet. It can require you to restrict you from protests. It can subject you to curfews. And so you're not in a prison, but you're effectively living in a prison in open air, is what they're saying. And they are concerned that, particularly for themselves who are protesting within the UK against China, that they will then end up falling foul of this, and this will affect them. And many Hong Kongers have experienced trauma in their protest lives in Hong Kong, and so now to come here and find out that they could be re-traumatized is actually shocking. The group says they have seen countless reports and stories of racism, misogyny in the police force, and so including the Sarah Everard case and many others, and therefore don't understand how you can give the power that you can extend stop and search when it's proved that it is a racist, or the implementation of this policy is completely covered in the blood of racism and misogyny. And so they are calling that this is, if other groups of color, and they're calling out racism, particularly against Black people, which I found quite interesting, and saying, if if they're experiencing this, everyone else is going to experience this. It's not only going to be them, it will be all of us. So if we don't look out for what's happening with them, then hey, we're going to be subject next, which I think is really a huge step forwards. But of course, the Home Office, the Home Secretary has been clear that we need to do more to protect the law-abiding majority, and therefore anti-protest laws need to go through. So this is a story that I thought Mr. Storm would like, but I also found that there was camaraderie in the story. There was an acknowledgement that they understood some of the social gravitas of what they were saying, how it was affecting other minorities. They used those minorities as the example to say, listen, you're not listening to these groups. You're not listening to the people that are actually crying out under the oppression of these so-called laws. Help us to, get rid of this awful oppressive system, which we know that Swiller Braverman thinks the public order bill will give the police the powers they need to prevent and respond to guerrilla tactics that cause misery to the hardworking people. That's what she feels is what's happening. Okay. Mr. Storm, any thoughts on my news story for today?
Yeah. One, I think in some ways it has a tie-in with the story I want to speak on. But also, it's just the concept that you need to protect law-abiding citizens. Well, I was law-abiding until you made my law-abiding activity illegal.
Yeah, right.
And I think people need to be mindful of this, because at which point will this Tory government draw the line under criminalizing what was hitherto seen as normal, peaceful, legal activities? Right? So anything you now do is at risk of being criminalized if they continue with this approach.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is the implementation of a fascist totalitarian government.
Yeah.
And you're seeing it slowly in the legislation that's being enacted, but you're seeing it much quicker in the attitudes of the politicians that are enacting it. So, for example, Rishi Sunak has already been fined during lockdown for partying, right? But he also seems to believe he can freely travel in a vehicle without wearing a seatbelt. He was fined again for that this week. Now, the fact that he's receiving fines still is important, but what this does is it highlights an attitude which the politicians have, in which they believe it is one rule for them and another for everyone else. Right? We see that, as I said, Rishi Sunak's been fined, and the amount of Tory politicians fined during lockdown for the parties that they attended. And to be honest, some of them actually should have gone to jail. It should have been a lot more than fines. And some of them only received one fine, despite evidence of them. No, I said evidence, not evidence. Proof of them attending more than one party. They only were fined once when they should have gone to jail. You see that in the fact that Nadeem Sahawi was trying to avoid paying tax. And this is what's problematic, is that he was the sitting chancellor negotiating the settlement for his tax avoidance.
I know that our viewers.
You need to understand the levels of corruption that are taking place. Right? You are the chancellor negotiating with HMRC your tax bill that you were avoiding paying. That's the levels of corruption that we're dealing with. And as I said, you would typically say, hey, you see these things in fascist governments, you see
Mhm,
these things
mhm,
in totalitarian governments.
mhm,
You know, these are things that the British public would say, hey, we expect to see these things in China, we expect to see these things in other countries. It's happening in your very own country.
mhm, 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 mhm. Yep. 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 Yeah. I mean, I hope that for our viewers, they understand that we highlight these things and we give you the tools to look these things up and the language around them, because it's really important to notice the trends, patterns, of what's happening. But it's important to notice who you're voting for, who you're supporting, what are the what are you actually aiming to do? Is it at the expense? And this is, one of the things that the Hong Kong group have decided to highlight. It's at the expense of the least of those in society, something that we, particularly as Christians, should concern ourselves with. When we see this level of corruption, we should think, oh, Babylon. We should immediately think of, okay, we need to concern ourselves with doing the right thing by those people who lack a voice. And in this case, you know, that I think too often we're complicit. So, yes. Thank you. Difficult stuff. So, what's your news story for today?
My news story is one that actually came out whilst we were on a break, and actually I wanted to talk about it, and probably it could have been something that was delved into a lot more detail than I'm going to do here. But it's about a report into Rhiannon Rudd. Now, she
Okay.
was a 15-year-old girl, and she was the youngest person in Britain to be charged with terrorism offenses.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, she committed suicide um, while she was during the course of the investigation. But the one of the things that also happened is that the charges against her were dropped because they declared that she was the victim of grooming and exploitation.
Okay.
Now, what had happened is that her mother was involved with someone
Hmm.
who turned out to be a white supremacist, and
Hmm.
he basically groomed her. Now, the Rhiannon ends up at a point where she is so far down the road, her own
Mm.
mother
Mm. Shops are.
reports her and shops her to
Hmm.
the authorities.
Hmm.
This was after she had downloaded the manual for making a bomb,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Now, here's the thing. I've said terrorism, I've said bomb. Most people are probably thinking, hey, she got caught up with some Islamic extremists.
Mm-mm.
No, she was caught up in white extremism,
Nationalism. Hmm.
right? And white nationalism.
Hmm.
So for me, looking at this story,
Hmm.
um, and I haven't found the report yet. I need to find the report because I want to read it in detail. But I find striking similarities and differences
To another case
to
that we
another,
may have mentioned here
right?
on
And
the
we have
dark side.
mentioned here, and that is the Shemima Begum case,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Where she is currently sitting in a refugee camp,
Hmm.
nationless,
Hmm.
right? Despite being a victim of grooming as a child,
Right.
right? The charges against her have not been dropped,
Mm-mm.
right? The punishments placed on her are severe,
Hmm.
right? Due to the and it got to the point where she has actually lost a child because of the circumstances that she has been placed in by the British government.
Yep.
Now, I have questions, which is, why is one seen as the victim of being groomed as a child
Mm-hmm.
and the other hasn't? Right? Is it because one is white and the other isn't? Is it because one chose to join white extremism
Mm-hmm.
and sought to commit acts of terror under that banner, and the other one was doing it under the banner of Islamic extremism?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we're talking about two girls of the same age
Mm-hmm.
when they were groomed.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, but we're talking about two vastly different outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, listen, I believe it's right that Rhiannon should have been declared a victim.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right? She was a child, she was groomed. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah.
Well, so is Shemima Begum,
Yeah.
right? And I I know, and I think people who listen to this will know that if Rhiannon Rudd had gone down the road of downloading a bomb making manual with the
Mm-hmm.
intention of making one, there is no way that, oh, and she had not been white, there is no way that charges against her would have been dropped and she would have been declared a victim. And
And
I
that's
think
heartbreaking.
but I think it's important that we say these things and we state these things.
Yeah. And I think it's important to highlight, we're not saying that because we think she should have been treated as harshly. We're saying that the reverse, because if you can have
No,
that much grace, you should have that much grace with the others also. Like, that's what we're asking for. We're asking for the same good judgment to be extended to other cases which don't meet your white criteria, for want of a better expression.
so
Yeah.
anyway, I just wanted to speak on that case.
Well, you never know. It may come up as a topic. There are some other topics that will be coming up shortly, so which may fit into that topic. But for now, we will head over to our main topic of thought for today, which is austerity. We're looking at a policy that the UK have enacted since 2010, officially, as far as I can tell. That was the first declaration that we were going to move into austerity measures, and it has lasted until this day. So it's been austerity measures have been in place for nearly 13 years now, in varying forms, without ceasing. It feels like there have been calls to have them dropped. There have been calls from all sides to that they need to be put down, but unfortunately that's not happening. So within the UK, this is a policy that has existed there since 2010. The reason that we're tackling it today is to look at the effects that it's having on ethnic minorities, particularly the Black community. But there are some other questions to be asked of it as well. So first and foremost, I'll give you what I found as a basic definition. I'm sure Mrs. Storm will quickly adjust me, but we'll see. So austerity measures is defined as the condition of a government or a nation adopting serious policies to bring down the impacts of an economic crisis. Austerity measures are implemented to avoid a debt crisis. Austerity is normally done in the short term and should not be a long-term policy. So again, we have to ask questions about what what Britain is doing then, because this has been a long-term policy. And this was enacted after the crash in 2008. And so one of the things to look at is as I said, these are defined as quick solutions to economic crises of countries. They're there to help manage a national budget to effectively, especially during times of weak economic growth. Can austerity cause poverty is one of the questions that is asked when you're looking at austerity, and it says, although it does not cause poverty, it does contribute to low wages, unemployment, and increased cost of living. So yes, is the answer. Austerity measures in the UK have meant, let's have a look at some of the main things that they have been cutting. So they had a cap on housing benefits, and that created a socially segregated no-go areas for low earners. Councils lost a third of their spending power, so that means buses, planning, housing, youth services, and sports facilities were either cut or sold off. National budgets for nature, although there were supposed to be a set number of trees planted every year due to, of course, climate crisis, the budget itself was cut in half, and they lost 1,000 of their inspectors. Child poverty has been at its highest level since the Second World War, and infant mortality has risen for the first time in 2 generations. It has had the effect that the threshold for claiming free school meals has halved. And so people who would have ordinarily been able to claim a free school meal due to low income or poverty are unable to do that, which has meant that more than 2,000 food banks have opened, which is 4 times the amount that were there. 4 times more people are on universal credit, which is the decade's all-time high, and universal credit can go to the employed as well as the unemployed, and so that's really important to note that this means that people who have jobs are claiming universal credit because the pay has been depressed and the prices have been increased. Some other parts of the policies are how ministers actually talk about people. Those policies have included blaming foreigners or immigrants or migrants or ethnic minorities. And of course, this has led
Once
people.
again, just to interject,
Yeah,
that's the hallmark of a fascist nation.
indeed. Indeed. The flip side of this, at the other end of the scale, so we've talked about all the cuts that have happened in terms of what does it mean in real terms for Britain and what the actual austerity plans were, so the amount of cuts that happened. But on the other side of this, what is interesting, of course, at the other end of the scale, you've had some of the highest bonuses paid to executives, 75 million for one particular executive. He got profits were misused. Total wealth in second homes, buy-to-lets, and flats rose by 941 billion. So people at the end who are able to afford many properties are reaping the reward and the profits. Although GDP and growth have both slowed, profits, however, have risen. A third of the UK billionaires kept their money in tax havens, and so therefore they keep their billionaire status quite easily. The May government during this time decided not to force transparency, and yeah, it's so there are winners and losers in the austerity measures, and the winners certainly are the rich, and the losers certainly are the poor. So, Mr. Storm, this is a really serious topic because it really does affect. The austerity measures have proven to affect the poorest in society. They've proven to affect those people at the lowest end of society while maintaining profit margins for big business, while maintaining billions for billionaires, and those numbers are ridiculously high. How do you see this affecting different communities? What should we be looking at when we
Right.
hear these kind of measures?
So before I go off on one, there's a couple of things I want to preface everything else I'm going to say with.
Okay.
One one of the things you said was we're going to look at how it affected minorities, ethnic minorities, black people in the UK. And I don't think we can do black people in the UK alone.
Yeah.
So I want to preface everything I'm going to say with when it comes to times of economic hardship, black people, by every study imaginable, are shown to do worse than everyone else.
Mm,
Okay. But when we're talking about austerity, there are matters of race, gender, and class that come into play in this.
mhm, mhm,
Right? And so, just whatever I'm going to say, it's going to affect everybody hard. Black people are always going to be at the bottom of the list. Right. Now, austerity is essentially um, governments trying to cut government spending by cutting government employment.
mhm, mhm,
All right. That's basically what happens. Um, and so I want you to, the reasons why I say this is a matter of class, gender, and race.
mhm,
Black people always do worse in times of economic hardship. Class, well, we've already established that the wealthy have just gotten wealthier through this, right?
mhm,
So it's going to affect those that are not wealthy, i.e., those in the working class, the
mhm,
most,
mhm,
right? But there's another phenomenon in this, which is gender. And that is that the public
mhm,
sector employs more women than
mhm,
any other sector.
mhm,
So if you want to balance the books
mhm.
by cutting employment, women are going to be disproportionately affected if they're the largest, if the public sector is the largest employment. So I want you to bear these factors in mind as we go through this discussion. Um, the current implementation of austerity isn't just within the UK, it's been something that's been implemented European wide.
Yeah.
Um, but the UK is a particularly nasty brand
Mhm,
austerity. And I think it's important that we look hard at the root causes of what brought about this European wide, and it's global as well to many regards,
mhm,
um, approach to austerity and implementation of it. And that is, it was essentially a private sector matter which the public sector, i.e., the taxpayer, then bore the burden for,
mm,
right?
mhm, mhm,
The banks behaved illegally and
mhm.
irresponsibly.
Yeah.
These are private entities
Mhm,
that the taxpayer ended up bailing out. Okay. Now, the in the UK, the Office for Budget Responsibility has said that the overall cost to the public is 23 billion, right? But that's peanuts because at
It's not
the
peanuts,
height,
huh? It's
no,
not
it
peanuts.
is at the height of uh, the financial crisis, when the British government was guaranteeing losses,
Mhm,
right? The overall package was estimated by the National Audit Office. What's the exact term? OAN, I believe it is.
mhm,
Anyway, to be 1 trillion.
I'm sorry.
So 23 billion is
real
peanuts.
number. That's not even a real number. What? A trillion? Okay, go on.
Right? So private entity, the public bears responsibility for. Right?
Yeah.
Now, once again, nobody's going to jail for this. Actually, I say nobody. It was in one of the Scandinavian countries. They sent the people at the top to jail. Iceland. There you go. Actually, is Iceland a Scandinavian country? I take it back. If there's any Icelandic people out here watching this, I don't think you're Scandinavian. So if I've gotten that wrong, I apologize. But yeah, so they sent the people at the top to prison. And rightly so. But once again, we're talking about class, ideas of class coming into this, in which those at the top, one rule for them, another for everyone else. Right? Because essentially we're talking about fraud being committed.
Yep.
So the approach to this, because this all hit under the Labour government. Gordon Brown was in office when this hit. And his approach to trying to deal with it was to cut VAT, right? And he tried to increase capital spending, right? To get more people to invest in the country, cut taxes, increase capital spending, etc. The Tories come in 2010 with the Lib Dem coalition. And basically, they just reversed all of that and said, you know what we're going to do is we're going to impose cuts. Now, for me, what has happened is that pretty much wherever you look within popular media, they have gone along with the Tory narrative. And where you're outside of the UK, they've gone along with the right-wing narrative of these cuts or austerity being inevitable.
Yeah.
There was no other option but to go along with these cuts. Well, firstly, we saw under Gordon Brown that there was actually a different approach. Right? Austerity was not inevitable. What it is a ideological. There you go. I'm struggling with words today. Ideological driven policy.
Yeah.
Right? And so when David Cameron comes into office, I don't know if you remember this, but he had a phrase he was throwing around: big society.
Big society. Waste man. Sorry.
Right? Now, what you have to understand is, if there's big society, what happens?
They cut what the premise of big society, and this was one of the sticking points when, from what I remember at the time in 2010, when he was floating this idea. The question was always, so you want us to replace what we have been paying with for our taxes, huh? So we've been paying for all of these services through our tax system, and you want to cut all of that while still increasing our taxes, and we then have to do the extra work that you are now refusing to do. And cutting, and I remember the cuts, it was like cuts to local services for mothers and babies. So all of the 0 to 5 services got cut in half, but you can replace that with local church groups, because we're a big society, we can all take our responsibility. Local cuts to libraries, cutting funding for libraries. I think it half the number of libraries in the UK, something like that. It was really drastic, the amount of libraries we lost in the UK. Small village libraries, all of those kinds of places where people went. And the idea was, in his mind, well, we believe in a big society in which we all participate and we're all doing things that help our neighbors. And if we all help our neighbors, then everything will be okay. Well, we were helping our neighbors by paying taxes. What's like, what are you talking about? That's part of the system. So yeah, big society.
Right. Now you have to understand,
Waste,
big
man.
society, where he talked up about community, what they publicly said it was for
Engagement.
community interaction and
Mm-hmm,
all of this nonsense, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it was actually a sleight of hand.
Yeah.
Right. So one thing to bear in mind, in the UK, between 2010 to 2015, local governments had their budgets halved. Right.
Yep.
So what happens is in the UK, your taxes go to a central government and then they're filtered back down into local governments.
Yeah.
Money coming into local governments was halved. Right. So where you're talking about your libraries going pretty much overnight, all of these things, this is a result of that policy. But why I say it was a sleight of hand is that where you have big society, the implication is small government. That would be what you would naturally think, yes?
You would if you didn't
But actually,
know.
when you have a Tory government, the implication is not big society, small government. The implication is big society, bigger corporations. Because under this policy of big society, 25% of public sector contracts were awarded to private entities.
It's insane.
So 25% of contracts that would have been awarded between one public sector entity and another and gave it away to private corporations overnight. Right? So you have to understand, this wasn't a concept of, hey, we're spending too much. This was a concept of we are not getting enough.
Well, now.
So the sleight of hand is that they're telling you, hey, look over here. We want to promote big society. We want to reduce spending. Whilst what they're actually doing is taking
increasing spending
money and increasing. And let's be honest, I think we can pretty much say that in every sector where we have seen nationalization in the UK, you get less for your money. Sorry, privatization in the UK, you get less for your money than you did when the services were nationalized.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So in the long term, consumers worse off.
Yeah.
The public are worse off. Right? So now what happens is that, sorry, I've got a bunch of notes here that I'm trying to keep it short and get through all of this, but it's a lot to go through. Right. So Peck in 2012 writes a paper and he argues that austerity is essentially national governments dumping a financial crisis onto local governments. Okay. And they do this by increasing the responsibility of local governments to provide services while decreasing the money that is given to the local government. Right? Now, and what this does is it widens inequality because the cities and the regions that are well off are able to handle the cuts better and still manage to maintain and provide quality services. But those that aren't have to cut. And what this does is it creates a self-sustaining cycle and argument for austerity. right? Because what happens is austerity, you have to cut services. So you
Mhm.
provide less services.
Mhm.
If you provide less services, central government says, well, you don't need so much money because you're providing less services,
Mhm.
right? So there's the argument that there's less need for it, so we
Mhm.
give you less money.
Mhm.
So less money leads to more restructuring and downsizing.
Yep.
And so the cycle begins and carries on. Hey,
Yeah.
you don't need the money, so therefore we don't need to give you the money,
Yeah.
right? So what that essentially does is the richer areas are still providing services. So central government will say, you need the money, you're providing services. So more money gets funneled into those areas.
Mhm. Mhm.
The poor areas that have to cut because they couldn't withstand and still provide the services have more and more money drained out of them,
Yep.
right? So, which areas are equipped to handle austerity cuts the best?
Rich areas. Areas with wealth already in them, where they can actually fundraise and put, have extras put in, like, those are the areas that withstand. Everybody else, you don't have the kind of leverage, to do that. And if I think about, the north-south divide that we have in the UK, where they talk about, the poverty gap within the north-south, you're talking about areas which are already underfunded,
Well,
underinvested in the first place. Like, not to mention, if I think about, I'm a Londoner, so, grew up in a city, that there are certain boroughs which are gonna suffer heavily because they have a higher proportion of poverty within those boroughs, even though they've been, pushed, the poverty has been pushed out, so to speak. It's still problematic.
right. So you see the issue of how class and
Mm.
austerity
Mhm.
interact,
Mhm.
right? And that's just a brief overview.
Mhm.
It's a lot more nuanced and complicated than that,
Yeah.
but that's essentially the nuts and bolts of how the system works in that way. But you
Yeah.
mentioned the north-south divide,
Mhm.
and that's very important because you're dealing with richer area in the south
Okay. Mhm.
versus the more working class areas of the north.
Mhm.
So the Office of National Statistics reported that between June 2010 and September 2012, there were 500,000 job losses in the UK, right? 35% of these came in the northern regions, right? And by the northern regions, I'm talking specific cities like Newcastle, Bradford, those sort of areas,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? Um, this correlated with a 20% increase in suicides,
No one's
right?
sadly, I'm not surprised. That's the worst thing about it. I'm heartbroken, but I'm not surprised.
Now, as I said, studies have been done that correlate this, but people might say, well, coincidence, et cetera, right? Here's the funny thing. And during this period, London saw a decrease in unemployment and saw a correlating fall in suicide rates. So anyone tempted to think, hey, it's just a coincidence.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, actually, I think you can see there's a correlation between unemployment and suicide rates and employment and a decrease in suicide rates, right? Um, but in addition to this, what qualitative research has found is that, okay, so austerity essentially, as I said, is to cut public spending by reducing public costs. And the major way they do that is by reducing the amount of people employed in the public sector. This itself creates a cycle because
Mm.
you people become unemployed, then what happens? They look for, or they look for another job, but whilst they're doing so, they look for support from the government,
Mm.
right? And in various countries around the world, it's in the UK or wherever, welfare, or some
Benefits.
countries it's called unemployment insurance.
Mhm.
I'm really struggling to get words out today.
Makes me feel
So,
better about myself.
okay. So you have more people now going to
Mhm.
the government saying, I need money,
Yeah,
but less people paying taxes.
right? Yeah.
So how does the government then deal with this?
The
They,
creation of new jobs would be a great one. I mean, the investment into the system or finding out where there is a tax, maybe avoidance system so you can recoup the taxes to ensure that your people can continue, something like that. In actual fact, they do the complete opposite. Huh? Hmm.
right. So what they do is they increase unemployment
Hmm.
because sorry, they increase unemployment, and simultaneously what they do is they make it harder for people to be eligible for relief from unemployment,
Yep.
right? And if you do manage it, they impose such draconian measures on you.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. Um, Now, qualitative analysis has shown that these policies and these measures and these approaches, actually what they do is it increases homelessness,
Hmm.
it increases food insecurity, and it increases mental health issues, right? Now, all of these things are essentially going to end up putting a drain on other areas of public spending.
Mm.
Because if you have a mental health issue,
You need
and
extra medical help.
right, if you're homeless,
You need extra help from the government.
right, and there's all of these other things that feed into it. But
Hmm.
what yeah. Now, this is where I want to delve a bit deeper into this, into where health and austerity intersect.
Hmm.
So, if we increase homelessness, right, what we do is we increase the risk when someone's homeless, increased risk of infectious diseases,
Yep.
increased risk to physical violence,
Hmm.
right? But there's also um, what it does is it also decreases their life expectancy,
Hmm.
right? Now, these are issues that are avoidable. One, we don't need austerity, but even if you're going to implement austerity, there are two methods by which austerity can be implemented.
Hmm.
One is by making cuts, and the other is by increasing taxes. And I'm going to come back to these two in a bit if we have time. Okay. Listen, as I said, I see the time. Um, so there was I need to get the name of this right. The European Federation of National Organizations Working with Homeless People. See,
Okay.
that's why I have to look at my notes to get that right. It's a long name. What they did was they conducted an analysis of European nations under austerity measures.
Hmm.
And what they concluded was that there was an increased vulnerability of families, specifically with children, to increased evictions, and repossessions. Okay. So, well, in some ways, it makes sense that families with children will be at the most risk. Because if I'm a single person and I'm in hardship, I can simply go and say, well, you know what? I'm going to go live with my parents. I'm going to go stay on a friend's sofa. But if I have children, it becomes a lot harder to do that.
Yes, but there is a yes, I understand that, but there's a fundamental problem in the way that we as humans are conducting ourselves. So at a time when people are vulnerable, at a time when there is increased unemployment, there are increased challenges, poverty is at an all-time high, children's poverty is the highest since World War II, etc., etc., etc. You knowing this as a landlord, you're going to victimize families. Like that's really where we went. There's an increased chance of evictions. When you say that, it sounds like, oh, this random corporate, but these are people who are enacting evictions. There are humans that are deciding that they can enact evictions during this time, and families are being evicted from their homes. Like, make that make
Now,
sense.
yes,
Make that make
it
sense.
doesn't
Like,
make sense. But you
what's
see,
wrong with you? Where's your
now you
humanity?
see, but
Where is anyway,
you're
go
jumping
on.
ahead here.
Okay.
You're jumping ahead here. You're just making a mockery of everything, that I had planned out to try and go through and lay things out. So
Oh,
since
I'm
you brought
sorry.
it up, I'm going to go into it because it comes back to how I started in the beginning,
Okay.
right? Where what you had was because a lot of landlords actually don't own their properties outright,
Okay.
right?
Right.
They
Yes. It's
so
mortgage-based system, so on and so forth. Yes. Debt
right,
debt is high. Yeah.
right. So what I want to bring you back to is the beginning problem of where you had a private sector problem becoming a public sector issue,
Okay.
where we now have a public sector issue that the private sector is refusing to take any responsibility for and
Right.
refusing to help out for because those landlords still have to pay their mortgages. The banks aren't going to ease them up and say, well, we understand there's a living crisis. So
Mhm.
we're not gonna make you pay penalties if you don't make your mortgage payments, or if you don't do this, or if you don't do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
They're just gonna evict them and say, "Well, we're gonna repossess it, sell it, and make our money back." So what we have is the people that caused austerity and burdened the public with the responsibility now refusing to accept any responsibility when the public are in trouble for an issue that they initially caused.
I can understand the kind of broad spectrum of it, but it also makes me sick to think that this involves actual humans making this decision, huh? So when we talk about the broad spectrum of it, there's a
Mhm.
culture, there's a trend, that this is what the whole industry is doing. This is how it makes it seem like almost you divorcing it from the humanity of the people involved. But all the people involved have a choice. All the people involved can actually affect change in these areas. And actually, all the people involved are complicit to
Yes.
the violence being enacted on people, where they're being made homeless, where their situation. Anyway, go
Look,
on.
all of this, as I said, you're absolutely right, but it's all ideologically driven because you're talking about a Tory government, and the Tories typically believe in unfettered capitalism, right?
Which is just
They're not a
unfettered
big
greed.
yes. Well, that's essentially what capitalism is that when it's unfettered,
Greed, greed, and
right?
more greed.
So the idea of a corporation
Mm.
having any form of social responsibility, they don't believe in that concept. but they do believe in the public having a responsibility to corporations and companies and things like this. Right. So I've really gone off. You've really put me off now by making me jump to the end and completing the cycle of where the issue goes back to. Now, oh, you've really thrown me now.
Sorry.
Right. Okay. Now I'm going to have to jump about. Anyway, so 2015, Figari, Paulus, and Sutherland state unequivocally that, quote, austerity is regressive, impacting on the poor, thus widening socioeconomic inequalities. Right? They go on to say that an analysis of historical austerity measures based on spending cuts as opposed to tax increases are much worse. Right? And I said I was going to come back to this point because we have had a number of conservative prime ministers. And each one of them has insisted on tax cuts for corporations and for the wealthy, as opposed to tax increases, which is a much better way of dealing with austerity. And that does not disproportionately affect the poorest and weakest in society. Right? And the fact that you could have, 5 prime ministers in the space of 13 years, and each of them are dedicated to cuts to public spending rather than an increase in taxation, should tell you that this is an ideologically driven principle. Because the reality is austerity is not working. And here's the thing. Austerity, what they said, or the point that they tried to tell the public is austerity is because the government's spending too much money. And you can't just spend. Then why has national debt increased?
Yes, you see, come with the clever questions. What are they spending the money on, huh? You must be spending it. Not spending
it on Baroness Moan, one of their Tory peers and donors.
Oh.
They're spending it on awarding PPE contracts to their friends with an illegal fast track lane to government ministers. Who then, their friends, don't supply equipment that actually works. They're spending it on awarding contracts, I've forgotten how many billion it was, on a track and trace app during COVID that never worked. Right? There's always money when it comes to finding it for their donor friends.
Yeah.
Right? And listen, the other reason this is ideologically driven, where it cuts to public spending as opposed to tax cuts, is where the energy companies come out saying we're making more money than we know what to do with. We're happy to pay more in taxes. And yet the conservative government refuses to implement higher taxes.
It makes me
sick. They were reticent to implement a windfall tax on energy companies. Right? So when we're dealing with austerity, we're dealing with something that disproportionately affects women, those who are less well off,
Mhm.
commonly referred to as the working class, but the reality is most people work. So when you're saying the working class, nah,
There's something odd about that title, isn't there?
right? Well, it's a euphemism for saying poor people, the peasants.
Mhm.
That's essentially what the saying, the peasants, right? Um, and I think there's an important point to be made here in that because there will be many people out there that would say, hey, people just want a handout. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Go get a job. Stop being a deadbeat. Stop lounging around. Stop lying on your sofa watching daytime TV.
Who are those
The
people?
majority of people in the UK who are living in poverty,
Mhm.
hear what I'm saying now?
Mhm.
The majority of people living in the UK who find themselves in poverty are actually in work.
Yep. Yep. One of the hardest things that people pills they need to swallow.
You know,
In fact, at this point, we could actually say, if you want to learn more about that particular aspect, Panorama did an episode a few months ago, I think it was, where they followed a number of working families and looked at the poverty. They did one on housing, if I'm not mistaken, and they did one on key workers and one on the effects of austerity on the ability, why people are claiming benefits, like the link between
yeah,
those. So if you're interested, BBC Panorama, you should be able to look them up in the back catalogue. I can't remember the exact episodes, but they did a really good job of showcasing families that are suffering, who are working. I think there was a nurse's family and something else. It was really, really heartbreaking to watch these
yeah,
families, but that's multiplied out because, of course, it's just one example of many people.
yeah. And look, I mean, that's if you have access to BBC iPlayer. If not, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation did a report into this in 2016.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, you mentioned bonuses,
Oh,
right?
adding up some
You
things.
mentioned the amount of money
Mhm,
that these companies were making.
mhm,
And I'm looking at how the current round of austerity has come about.
mhm,
Policies of austerity have come about, and they've come from the
mhm,
private sector. And I'm
mhm,
looking at the attitudes of the private sector towards this versus the public sector and how austerity interacts with that.
mhm,
And one of the things that is important to note is that austerity does not treat companies and corporations the same way it does the public citizen and individual,
mhm.
right?
Okay.
And by that, I mean austerity says you're spending too much money.
Mm,
We can't afford this. We need to make the cuts.
mhm.
And where we're going to cut is your services,
Right. Wrong, but correct.
right? Now, here's the thing. One of the things to keep in mind is that if the majority of people living in poverty in the UK are
Mhm,
working people, that
mhm.
means the company's not paying them enough to live,
Yeah, absolutely.
right?
Mhm,
Now, if we're going to talk about austerity,
mhm.
why aren't the bonuses being cut in order to pay the workers more?
Oh, no.
Hmm?
You could hurt somebody's feelings.
Why aren't you cutting the benefits packages for those at the top in
Mhm.
order to pay more? The
Yeah.
concept of austerity only seems to apply to public sector.
Yeah.
But once again, you have the public sector taking on a private sector problem
But this
because where you pay welfare
Mhm,
for people that are working, the public sector is acknowledging and accepting that the private sector is not carrying its weight, therefore we must pick up the slack.
Mhm, mhm. And I think what people need to understand, or what people should recognize, is there are key buzzwords that surround this issue. So when this has been picked up by different politicians as issues, or different pressure groups as an issue, that, you know, actually this could resolve one of the basic issues, is a fairer distribution of pay within a company, as opposed to your top managers earning millions to billions, while your workers who do the majority of the work are earning pennies. You could actually redistribute that quite fairly. What has been said is the demonization. This is a twofold. So on the one hand, you get, well, in order to attract the top people, you need to pay top wages. We have to keep competitive with the rest of the world. People won't want to work for us if they're not going to, and we need the top minds in the top jobs. So there's the kind of glorification of these roles as being something so amazing that only special people can do them, and only these sparkly people that we can attract from overseas or from other places, we need to do that. And on the flip side of that is the demonization of the working person who's doing the majority of the work as lazy. If they just if they what's the common phrase? You hear this in the newspapers. If a person doesn't like their job and they're not being paid fairly, then they just need to look for a new job. They need to go for a different field of work. You know, if they would just put in the effort, they would be able to work somewhere else. They would be able to go somewhere else and get another job and demand higher pay. If they were able to work it out and be competitive, they would be able to do that. So you have this over glorification of those people at the top, idealizing them. But you also have, on the flip side of that, the demonization of the people working at the bottom, saying, oh, well, they must be stupid, they must be slow, they don't deserve to get paid in that way, that's wrong to pay. They're not specialized workers. Specialized workers are the ones that deserve pay, the ones that went to, you know, specialize in MAs and universities or whatever. Those are the ones that deserve it, and not the other way around. And I think that's a really important way of looking at some of those buzzwords.
That's true. However, I think it's more insidious than that. And you see that with what's happening in the UK right now. Because it's more than just saying that they're lazy. And once again, remember at the beginning I said that the popular media just went with the Tory narrative: austerity cuts are
Necessary.
Once again, the media feeds into this narrative and promotes the line. And why I say it's more insidious than what you just said is that they flip it. It's not just that they're lazy. Think about now who's being portrayed as unreasonably greedy.
Oh, what, the nurses, the
The
firefighters,
same people you clapped
the
are the
workers.
same people you're now calling greedy because they simply want to be able to stop going to food banks and be able to live off the wages which their employer is meant to provide them.
You know, the
So
question they
it's
keep getting asked when you see the interview, so you know, a tip for people listening to these things is, oh, is this just about pay? Is that why you're striking? So you can just, is this just about money? What do you mean, is this just about money? No, this is the ability to live. If I have to claim benefits, if I can't afford to pay rent, if I can't afford to eat, people are leaving because they can't afford to be the profession they trained for. Like, what is this just about money? Was it just about money when you're paying those bonuses to the top people? Like, what are we saying here? So when you hear those questions being asked by interviewers, which I have heard repeatedly over the last weeks and months, oh, we're just interviewing you. Why are you on the lines? What is the reason you're here? And the person starts to begin to explain, you know, their colleagues are leaving because they can't afford to eat, they can't afford to do this. And the person said, so this is a money issue then? So this is just about money? No, this is about eating and living. What do you mean it's just about money? What are you
no,
talking about?
but you see, the thing is, I would answer that question and just be point blank. Yeah, it is about money. I need money to pay my rent or my mortgage. I
Well,
need money to buy
this is what
food.
people are saying, but what people
I
hear,
need,
but this goes to
but
the point that you're making.
right. But what I'm saying is, is that the truth of the matter is being lost. Their message is being lost because they're saying, no, it's not about money while asking for a pay rise.
No, people are saying it is about money. They're saying, yes,
Mhm.
it's about money, but it's about the ability to pay their rent, to have food, to actually
Mhm.
employ other workers, to actually, all of these issues are wrapped up in money. But what I'm saying to people who are listening to this is what you're hearing often isn't the full answer. You stop listening
Mhm.
because you hear the interview go, oh, is this just about money? Like, oh, you greedy person.
Mhm.
So this is all money based. And the answer is yes. A lot of people just say, yes, this is about money. Yes, this is about the ability to earn, to put food on my, I don't do this for free. I'm not doing the job because you clapped for me, huh? You clapped, that's wonderful. How am I going to pay my bills? You clapped, that's great, but how am I going to eat? You clapped, I need to pay for childcare. You're clapping is amazing, but I'm a human being with actual needs that need to be met, and people are answering that question, yes. But what I fear is happening, and what I think is happening to a lot of people, as soon as they hear the question, oh, is it just about money, it turns it into a greed issue and not into a necessity issue. Because not asking, so is this about a pay gap that you have? Is this about a wealth inequality? Is this about the ability to pay your bills? What there is the questions underneath, but they don't engage with those questions. They stick to a very surface level in the journalism, which is the workers are on strike because they're demanding more pay. Oh, greedy them. And if those of you will remember, when the rail workers go on strike, this is one of the main tactics they use against the rail workers is, oh, look how much they're actually paid. They're paid a little bit more than the average earner in the UK. So how dare they go on strike and demand more pay? Who's that setting you against? It's setting you, it's setting poor against poorer. So just because they receive a
Mhm.
little bit more than you, they're still not making it. But because they receive a little bit more than you, how dare they go on strike to demand a better system of pay that enables them to live? What?
And here's another thing for anyone in the UK who watches this, right? And who is predisposed to vote Tory or who is against nationalization of utility services. The British government pays the companies that operate the rail services for any losses incurred during a strike. So when the rail workers go on strike, the taxpayer is still footing the bill. If you're still footing the bill, you might as well just nationalize the service, right? But here's the thing. Anyone who thinks that somebody going on strike and demanding an 11% pay increase to bring themselves in line with the current levels of inflation is being unreasonable or greedy, you need to ask yourself, how is it then that these companies justify paying bonuses in the hundreds of thousands or millions,
Mm,
which are
mm,
many times the national average
mm.
of a worker's salary, right? And this is not considered to be greedy. This is not considered to be unaffordable,
Right, right.
right?
Oh, but they
So
earned it.
listen, if you think some top fat cat at an energy company earned 30 million in a bonus more than, you know, Jenny Blogs down the street who's a nurse or a doctor who's saving someone's life, you seriously need your head checked.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you, but the disconnect that people have between the narratives, people don't often put these stark realities up against each other and say, look at the reality of what you're saying. On the one hand, you've had a news story saying this, and you're celebrating. You say, how wonderful. These people are generating wealth they're employing people in our economy. And on the other hand, the same employer is not paying their staff, and the staff are having to strike to get pay. Hold those two up together. hold the actual mirror up and see them and move beyond the kind of media and the propaganda that's being put out by governments, private enterprises, and media. You have to move beyond that point. You have to step beyond what you're being told and go, hang on, there's a disconnect here between what you're lauding as great and wonderful and what is being demonized, and actually put those two things together and say there's a problem with this picture.
So I know we've gone off on a bit of a tangent. I just want to remind people why it came up, and that's because private entities are not subject to the same criteria that would bring about austerity in a public context, despite being the cause of austerity measures
Mm-hmm.
in a public context.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is critically important that we bear that in mind and that people bear that in mind when people talk about austerity, when people are saying, hey, we're going to strike because we need more money, we
Mm-hmm.
need this, we need that. That the current implementation of austerity measures globally
Mm-hmm.
is due to the greed of private entities.
You said what you said. It is what it is.
And we should not allow these private entities that have caused these social ills to escape without repercussion.
Mm.
In fact, not only are they escaping without repercussion, they're actually doing better because of it.
And that's I think one of the biggest points. Like it really has driven home the point that when we talk austerity, people there's a disconnect from the word. It's like, it's an older word. Maybe I don't use that in my everyday language. So this is just a measure that you're bringing in, not realizing that these policies have got far-reaching effects.
Yes. As I said, I mean, there's so many. There are so many. Like, we could talk about the mental health. I touched on suicides, but
Mm-hmm.
the impact on mental health issues and how it actually disproportionately affects those with pre-existing mental health issues.
Mm-hmm.
Because once again, you cut services, you cut mental health
Yeah.
services, but those you also cut benefits for those with mental health. Those with mental health issues sometimes are not able to manage finances
Mm-hmm.
and everyday activities like that without support. You cut their support, which then means that, hey, maybe they fall into a category that falls behind on rent or paying utility bills or things like this, which then means their increased likelihood of eviction. All of these factors play in. And I think people need to understand that austerity, when you think austerity is only affecting someone else and not you, you're not seeing the bigger picture,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because when people are made homeless, they still need somewhere to live,
Mm-hmm.
right? If they don't have somewhere to live, they end up on the streets, right? So even if you want to be selfish in your motives for this, understand if homeless people start living outside your door, your property prices drop,
Mm.
right? There are unforeseen consequences that affect you, right?
Yep.
And whilst they can keep it right now maintained to poorer areas, because think about it, I don't know if you remember that when they um, Part of the austerity measures were that they cut the number of times refuse was collected. I remember the problems that that created,
Yeah,
right?
one's affected.
Okay, but here's the thing: refuse is a collection, is a public role.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing: you're cutting that in the poor areas, but at some point, you got to remember it's the poor people that are collecting the refuse for the richer people.
Mhm.
At some point, the cuts are going to affect the poor people that they're
Yeah.
not going to be able to collect the refuse for the richer people. At
Mhm.
some point,
Mhm.
it's going to hit you,
Mhm. Mhm. So
right?
even
So
if you're
even
doing it from selfish interest, it's like, do something. Don't just pretend it doesn't.
austerity, even if you do it for self-interest, even if you do it in self-interest, you need to understand austerity is not a good measure for you
Yeah.
unless you are literally at the top of the food chain, in which case you'd be insulated from such things.
Yeah.
The majority of us aren't.
Yeah. Indeed. I just want to highlight a few statistics because we did in the promo of this and in the sort of subtitles and everything, the intros, we talked about the effect on Black households and how this would affect minority groups. So I just want to highlight a couple of things that when we talk about austerity, of course, it has this effect that maybe people aren't really putting the two things together. And I think you see this in many countries within the European context, is that there is although all poor people are being affected, there is a blame game that happens that makes people think that one group is being affected by another group, thereby setting the same people being affected by the same problem of the government's austerity cuts. But instead of turning your attention to the government and saying, okay, you are our actual problem, the government's propaganda machine turns you against each other, and the infighting then continues the austerity for longer. Because instead of tackling the problem, you guys are busy blaming and doing these things with each other. So I just want to have a look at a couple of reports that came out and just give you some basic statistics on things that should help you to think about the effect that this then has on ethnic diversity, ethnic diverse majority nation groups in minority, who are minorities in their country. Okay, so the UN last year did a report on the Tory policies and how it was impacting ethnic racial inequality in the UK. And so a UN expert on racism comes in and does an 11-day assessment to look at, and this is normal, you know, you say 11 days, what can you learn? You can learn quite a lot in 11 days. But they looked at what was happening across the country. They visited a number of different cities as well as detention centres, and these are some of the findings of it. One of the things it concluded is that the Windrush scandal was a glaring example of discriminatory policies that the UK's immigration policy put in place. It talks about the national debates in the aftermath of the EU referendum that amplified racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance in the UK. It said that public and private actors have played dangerous roles in fueling intolerance. Among them are politicians and media outlets, which have given special attention to the significant influence of the command in society. It is the second part of the report published looked at poverty and said that under the conservative poverty welfare policies, basically meant that the poorest people were living solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives. That's a quote. Those are the actual words they used. And so unless austerity was ended, their lifespan was going to be decreased. After visiting detention centres and 7 cities, the austerity measures had disproportionately, detrimentally affected members of racial and ethnic minority communities who are also the hardest hit by unemployment. So this is looking at some of the issues that are affecting the whole of, like, you know, the poverty aspect, but setting groups as aside from each other. That's a direct quote from the report. One of the reports cites that there is research from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which estimates that Black households particularly will have seen a 5% loss in income. Now, I'm going to read another report, which actually says it's 17.5% loss in income on average is what they've seen. So when you think about the loss in income, you have to think about it set against the increase in prices that they're seeing and how vast that is going to affect people. These cases say the racial discrimination expert says that race and ethnicity continue to determine the life chances and well-being of people in Britain in ways that are unacceptable and in many cases unlawful. And you know, the report is damning. It's you know, as UN reports often are. We've seen that in other countries, that UN reports can be absolutely damning of countries and nothing happens. And this report went on and on and on about these things. Another report that I want to look at is one that looked at poverty and the Black and Asian female experience, and it talks about that households in the lowest fifth income. So now we're talking about the real in the poverty groups. For Black and Asian people, they experience the biggest average drop in living standards of 19.2 and 20.1% respectively. This equates in real terms an annual average loss in living standards of £8,000 to £11,000. And that's a huge amount of money. They talk about the fact that under Theresa May's government, she's committed. She said out loud that it's a country that works for everyone, but the policies are actually injustice and inequality, and people are just managing to live everyday lives. And some of those statistics that come out of this is the report on intersecting inequalities, the impact of austerity on Black and minority ethnic women in the UK. That's the report that you can read. And they talk about the fact that families, Black families particularly, and Asian families as well, in the lowest, poorest fifth of households, are literally paying for austerity to the tune of between £8,000 and £11,000 per year. And those numbers are increasing. They are at a deficit. And so when we're talking about all of these measures that we've talked about throughout the show, all of these things that are setting the stage for what is really harsh living standards for people, it is being offset by a propaganda machine, which the UN has identified, particularly as politicians and media working hand in hand, that has put xenophobia, racism at the center of the problem, as opposed to the austerity measures. And it says in most cases, this is illegal. What they are doing is illegal. How they are affecting people's lives is illegal, but they're doing it anyway. And instead of, and now we have to look at, you know, white majority nations and say, instead of you guys biting back against that narrative, you're buying in hook, line, and sinker and setting yourself against people of different ethnicities. The question has to be asked is that changing your position? Are you less poor when you blame a Black person, when you blame a different ethnicity? Are you less poor when that happens? Has it put more money in your bank account? No, you're still poor. You're still suffering. It's not helping you in any way. So can you not see that this is a tactic, a tool of a government to manipulate and control its population by setting them against the immigrant, against the minority, against different people within their walls, within their country, so that they can get their own way, which is to continue to make profits in their private sector industries and at the expense of poor people.
Crabs in a barrel. And by that, I mean, when you put crabs in a barrel, they will climb all over each other to try and get out of the barrel. That none of them get out of the barrel.
Mhm.
But in doing so, the observer blames the crab, not the fisherman that put them in the barrel in the first place. Crabs don't belong in a barrel.
Well, there you go. And I think that's I wish for people, I wish for people who identify as white, because they're, European people, I mean, people of European descent can identify as different things. But I wish for people who identify as white to understand that this is a tactic to divide and ensure that rich people stay rich and you stay poor. Because it is not helping your situation that you're blaming. It's giving you something to do, obviously. I mean, you're busy in your hatred. We started the show with stories of people grooming young people in order so that they can build bombs, etc., and continue this. So we started the show with it's keeping you busy, but it's not actually creating a change or a shift in your situation. You're still affected by the same poverty issues, the same mental health, the same lack of pay, the same inequalities in access to various services. You're still affected by your city has no libraries. That affects the people, your neighbors, as well as it affects you. If your city is hospital services are cut, that affects your neighbors as well as you. There's not employing more people. In fact, it's just cutting more people in those jobs. So if you could just raise your head for a moment above what you've been told, that you are so special as white people, and just look to your left and your right and think, hang on, how come in all the generations that we've been told this, we're still poor? We have generational poverty that is affecting us, and it has not changed or shifted. If you look at the inequality between North and South, that shift has not happened. Why is that?
And
Why is that?
I think the scary thing is they're not asking this question. And in conjunction with that, our systems and processes of manufacturing and our technological advancements are at the position where nobody in the world has to go hungry, where everybody can have a home, where you don't actually have to work 5 days a week in order to live, not survive, live,
Live. Mhm.
right? And they're not taking into account the changing landscape of the world. The technological advances mean a machine is going to take a job over.
Mhm.
You don't have to do that job anymore. Instead of saying, how then do we adapt society? Because a
Mhm.
machine now does the job. I don't have to do it anymore. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. Let me go do
Great.
something I enjoy that's worthwhile
Yeah.
because, as I said, it's not
Let's pay
necessary
it.
for you
Let's pay
to
our
do that
doctors and
job anymore,
nurses then. Let's pay, the people that
right?
do all of those jobs. Let's pay them
All of
instead.
these things,
Because
instead of
more
saying,
people will
let's
be
see how we can craft society to redistribute the wealth,
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
then
mhm.
because the reality is we are heading towards problems,
Yeah.
massive
Yeah.
problems societally,
Yeah.
because a service industry, a service-based society or economy can only
Mhm.
support so many jobs,
Yep.
right? And then at that point, what then do you do
Yeah.
with
All
those that
those
are
people.
unemployed? And
Mhm.
the more industries become mechanized,
Yep.
the greater the technological advances, the
Mhm.
less demand that there will be for employment.
Mhm.
We don't have a society equipped for that, and there is no indications of a move towards a society that can handle that. So the longer and further we entrench in the way things are now,
Mhm.
the greater the societal upheaval will be. And my concern is that, when you see those dystopian TV shows
Mhm. Mhm.
and movies
Mhm.
in which the rich are walled off in
Yes.
cities
Yes.
with surrounded with armed guards and all that, My concern is that that is actually the society that we will actually be moving towards,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, if things are machine operated, there's nobody with a conscience pulling the trigger,
Nope.
right? It's all automated.
Mm-hmm.
And then what are you going to do? You're going to fight with each other for scraps. You're going to.
Mm-hmm.
No.
It's a horrible thought, the way that we have entrenched into these particularly white supremacist ideas that help fuel a system that is based on inequality, that is based on the rich getting richer and the poor being poorer, and keeping it that way. It's entrenched in that system. The more problems that we're setting ourselves up for, because the more you distract yourself with the fighting over
Mhm.
the white and the black, whatever variation you have within your country, the more you're not seeing that there is a bigger problem that is brewing in your future.
And I wish people would adapt their micro solutions and their attitudes towards micro things to macro things. You know, it's like you go get a Roomba, so the vacuum cleaner goes off automatically and you don't have to vacuum. You go, praise the Lord, that's something I don't have to put my energy into doing, that I don't enjoy doing. Let me do something else with my time.
Mm, mm,
You know, I can choose to spend it doing something I enjoy or something else that needs to be done.
mm,
I don't try and find a task for you to do that, or you don't try and find a task to do for the sake of doing it,
mm,
you
mm,
know, and say,
mm,
no, you put your energies into other things.
mm.
We need to take that attitude towards the mechanization of industries
Yeah.
and society and say, look, machines doing it, praise the Lord. What can I go and do that I enjoy? Or what
Add value.
else needs to be done?
There you
Let me
go.
not just have you doing something for the sake of doing something. What actually does society need to be done?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And one of the things is we don't need to be paying bosses £70 million bonuses.
But nurses and paramedics and firefighters and public service workers who run all of the local services that you need, everyone needs, do deserve to be paid.
Look at it this way. You see all the libraries they took out with these austerity cuts?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When you mechanize an industry, train the people to be librarians. Bring back the libraries.
Well, you see how they cut 100,000 jobs from the NHS? I don't know. How about training the people to go do those jobs and then paying them to do them? How about that? Just saying.
In fact, it should tell you everything you need to know about the direction society is headed in, where the Tories under austerity, one of the first things they cut was the police. And now that inequality has gotten so much wider under austerity, the first thing they implemented back into public sector was police,
Shocker, huh? Shocker.
right? It should tell you
Shocker.
everything you need to know because they are concerned about the fact that there's going to be a breakdown in society,
Yeah.
which is why the first thing they increased was not something that would impact and improve the health of the citizen.
No.
It was what would protect the rich and wealthy.
Well, I feel like we have really covered austerity in a way that maybe people haven't dived into before, and given them a really great intro into the topic, particularly with its impacts on all kinds of people, and how I think Johnny mentioned it in his comment, which is, shifting away our focus from root causes, we've helped to highlight that, you know, there are root causes to this problem, as opposed to being part of the xenophobic, racist, white supremacist ideas that you may be locked into. You could maybe look at the actual root causes of the problem. And I hope that what people take away from this is that, you know, if we don't do this together, if this is not something we're actively working on finding solutions for, we're going to, as you say, have these realities lived out and played out, which are violent and painful, I think is the reality. And both stories, news stories at the beginning of the hour. So if you want to go back and listen to those, anyone who's watching this back or maybe joined in later, you can go back and listen to the news stories, play into those ideas, the draconian laws being brought in to cover protest, those that look like they come from countries that you would anticipate are elsewhere, but they are bringing them in within Britain. The fact that white supremacists are grooming young ladies to make bombs and do those sorts of things. You know, these really violent ends are problems and clashes that are coming in our future, unfortunately, if we don't actually do something about it and begin to make some shifts and changes in our ideologies and thinking. That's my humble submission today. Do you have something you would like to add as a final word?
Yeah. Fight the power.
Well, on that note, we thank you for joining us here on the Dark Side. We are here every Sunday evening, or you can watch it back. I see we've had a question come in. Maybe we should tackle that quickly and see if we can do that before I sign off. Maybe a part of the issue of people not asking these questions may lay in the facts of go-to tools of solving problems. I see the questions being raised by those who turn to the power of ideas as tools of problem solving, protest the system, while the greater majority of lower-end societies turn to fiscal strength as the problems. Fight someone in my reach. Yeah, that is the opposite solutions to a problem. So we think of protesting against the government and trying to change policies and doing those things, and then other people are thinking about that tension between that and thinking about how we are impacting just our neighbor instead of fighting the closest person to us as opposed to the actual person who's the problem. It's problematic.
And I think that is why trade unions are so important. Because what they do is that they galvanize those at a lower end of a financial spectrum into an effective unit to fight for systemic changes. And that is why there has been so much effort into breaking unions over the past couple of decades. Because, listen, the trade unions in the UK, Lord knows, I can tell you from having seen things. My father was heavily involved in the trade unions. So when I was a kid, I'd see things, and there were lots of injustices. There was racism. And they had to sort out their own issues. But it was much easier to have those conversations and have those discussions and have those conflicts even within that space, and moving towards dismantling a larger system, right? Where you don't have trade unions, you have the sole person fighting against the system, and that will never work. The system will grind the individual down. So that's why I'm a firm advocate for trade unions as being a tool to protest the system. And as Johnny says, you know, those that lack the fiscal strength fight someone within the reach. Trade unions allow you to galvanize and unite and stop fighting the people within your reach, and to actually target the system itself.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much for that last question. Thank you for joining in, Johnny, and thank you for watching this Dark Side. We know we've run well and truly over, but we thank you for the time that you take to join us each week as we discuss an issue. Next week, we will be looking at, let me see if I can remember the subject. Do you remember what we're doing? Now I'm stuck for my subject for next week. Hold on one second. Sorry. Next week we'll be looking at the over-policing of Black children. So the adultification and over-policing of Black children will be our topic next week. And as always, we'll begin with a couple of news stories that have popped up during the week. On that note, we are praying for the families of those who have lost loved ones this week due to police violence, but also due to mass shootings and other things. Have a wonderful week. We will see you next week on The Dark Side. Peace out. You can say bye also if you want.